I am Jacob Gage, and this is my presentation on Can We Fix Gender Equality in Sport? What comes to mind when you think of women in sport? Personally, I think of the WNBA, LPGA, Women's National Soccer Team, and women in broadcasting. These are just a few of the things that I think of when I think of women in sport. How much money do women make in sports compared to men? On average, women make in the WNBA $102,000. In the LPGA, they make about $141,000. The women's national soccer team makes $40,000 on average. And in broadcasting, women make $38,000 on average. For men in the NBA, they make on average $7.3 million. This is a big jump from $102,000 for women. In the PGA on average, they make $1.5 million. This is a big jump on average from the LPGA, just like the WNBA to NBA. The U.S. men's soccer team actually makes more than the women's soccer team on average, $60,000 for men, $40,000 for women, and for broadcasting, it's about the same. In broadcasting, only 14% of broadcasters are actually women, 86% are men. How do we fix this, people might ask? You can see the obvious gap between men and women in their respective sports/fields. When this topic is brought up in media, the media seems to ignore it and nothing ever comes about it, is what I've noticed. The gap between the WNBA players and NBA players is huge, but the reason isn't because of sexism. The NBA just generates more money. Why can't the WNBA generate this much money? I think a good way to make equality more equal in sport would be to boost media exposure for women's sports, get events like WNBA games on prime time on ESPN when there's no other events on that people can watch, so they have to watch these women's sports, and then they could promote charismatic athletes in women's sports. I think the WNBA does the best job of this because I know a lot more WNBA players than I do from other women's sports. I think a great way to get eyes on female sports is to somehow get them on primetime windows and on popular channels that most people aren't, because most people aren't actively searching for these games. I think if they're put on ESPN and it is right in front of people for them to watch, they will be much more inclined to watch these games. I also think gambling and sports betting could help equality. I think the rise of popularity and prevalence of sports betting in our country could really help and boost interest for women's sports. I think if more people are interested in watching these sports, they will grow in popularity. Gambling promotions are very popular in men's sports. Why not in women's sports? I see deals all the time for first-time users of apps. If they bet on a basketball game, they could win more money if they're a first-time bettor. I think these could work in women's sports as well. A primetime event and sports betting advertisements could make watching women's sports a lot more popular for people who don't already watch them. Why exposure will help equality? I think exposure brings a lot more eyes to the sport, and more exposure could generate new fans, and these new fans would continue to watch the sports, and they would grow attached to the teams and players within them. I think the WNBA needs more eyes on it because there are many talented women athletes in the WNBA. I think more fans and interest will generate more money for these leagues. I think interest can come with gambling and sports betting. I think sports betting could bring a lot of interest to women's sports. Even in the LPGA, you can bet on golf. You can bet on male golfers. You can also should be able to bet on women's golf. As interest and money into sports rise, for the athletes will get paid more. Athletes don't get paid that much in women's sports because there just isn't enough money generated for them. I think if we can get more money into the pockets of the WNBA, we can get that into the players' pockets as well. In conclusion, I think that making women's sports more accessible and more watchable and having standalone games could help the growth and interest in women's sports. I think if gambling is integrated the right way, women's sports can be just as big as men's sports when you're talking about it from a gambling aspect. The more interest and more fans that we bring to women's sports could get salaries and pay up for women, and this would help men and women's sports become just as equal. That is the end of my presentation.